Hello, my friends. Let's talk about open world games. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. So, for this one, I decided that rather than having a shorter video, things are going to get a bit long. So, think of this more as a podcast than anything else. Video games as a medium have a very unique problem of facing an inability to define genres, in a satisfactory way at least. While some games have found a level of comfort with using the same genres as books and movies, such as horror and action adventure, most others struggle with this quite a bit. But then there's the issue of gameplay. A person who loved the scares of Outlast isn't necessarily going to enjoy playing the RPG Maker darling Corpse Party. And in that same way, a Call of Duty player won't necessarily enjoy BioShock just because both are first-person shooters. And so that highlights some problems with defining things by game mechanics themselves. Books and movies and shows are all passive entertainment, and the basic structures of storytelling have existed for thousands of years. So it makes sense to define their genres by the kind of story being told. But the uniquely interactive medium of video games haven't existed for even a single century yet. Thus, it is entirely reasonable that we simply don't know how to define game genres in the best way. But in the industry's youth, a number of genre naming conventions have developed. Game genres are usually based on player character movement, camera placement, map design, the size of the development studio, or the narrative structure. For some examples, player character movement genres are things like platformer, endless runner, shooter, racing, turn-based RPG, or real-time strategy. Camera placement refers to things like first-person shooter, third-person shooter, top-down, god games, free camera. Map design often refers to things such as linear, dungeon delvers or dungeon dives, sandbox games, and open world. The size of the studio is something none of us are unfamiliar with. The AAA game, indie games, first party or third party, as well as the now extinct term of AA games, or a B studio. And then narrative structure, such as role-playing game, point-and-click adventure, visual novel. All of these sort of things are the basic categories that we use. Usually, it is the case that no single genre tag is sufficient to describing the feel that a developer wants to sell. As a result, we typically mix and match the common tags, or even invent new ones when we think we've made something unique. The terms hero shooter and Souls-like come to mind. Because of this problem of specificity, that often results in people simply not getting the kind of game they want to experience, I fall into the camp that thinks we should find a way to classify games not just by the indefinitely varied number of mechanics and ways to design games in general, but by something more fundamental, something more common. The closest thing I've encountered that matches this is the idea of a core engagement. That thing that games focus on that causes a player to feel rewarded and entertained. Bartel's taxonomy of socializers, killers, achievers, and explorers provided this sort of approach for multiplayer games that became instrumental in how massive multiplayer online games are made, and in turn moved on to affect the entire industry as a whole using common features like achievement trophies and leaderboards. Bartel's taxonomy and the idea of core engagement have been remarkably functional in helping to think about games and advance creating gaming experiences with more depth. However, when we actually talk about games as consumers, or talk about games in terms of games media, we tend not to even talk about the idea of core engagement at all. But why should we give priority to something like core engagement? Why not just use both the naming conventions we are accustomed to, and also use core engagement as a side note? Well, mostly I think that's because if we decide that core engagement is okay as a side note, we'll just continue going on without using it as an evaluative scheme anyway, which is largely what we've already been doing. This is because not giving preference to core engagement can and has caused the loss of entire genres of games. games that luckily have come back in different forms recently. The main way I can talk about this is to talk about how problematic the genre of open world has been over time. The first version of open world games that we'd recognize today are the open map 3D platformer and collectathon games. Games like Spyro and Mario 64. These games had multiple open maps with items to collect as players ran vaguely towards some larger goals. But the separation of loading screens and the language of more familiar 2D platformers prevented these games from being called open world. Then Grand Theft Auto came out, and the idea of an open world without hard and fast goals became the ideal. We eventually developed the term sandbox for such games. But thanks to GTA, the setting of an open world or open map game became the way to make big games. Racing games like Need for Speed, superhero games like Spider-Man and Infamous, and Western role-playing games all started adopting it wholesale. As a result, people began to lose interest in turn-based and tactics RPGs and 3D platformer collectathons. Or at least games media began talking about those genres as if they were played out and obsolete compared to these new standards. The Ubisoft open-world games came to define what open-world genres mean on consoles. Assassin's Creed as a series was for a time the epitome of this genre on its yearly release, while World of Warcraft redefined what a massive multiplayer online game on PC could be, and games like Saints Row tried to double down on the aimless fun of Grand Theft Auto. Whenever publishers came out claiming that their next big release was the largest map they've ever made, even up through Fallout 4, it was met with the common wisdom developed through years of Assassin's Creed-esque games. It doesn't matter how big the map is if there's nothing to do. As if they forgot all of the self-made fun that people got out of GTA and Tony Hawk games that weren't actually purposeful markers or objectives included in the design. Then came The Witcher 3, the 2015 open-world game masterpiece that was hailed as the standard bearer for open-world games in the future. And for a time, this was the case. Fallout 4, as the next pedigree open-world game, was compared to The Witcher thoroughly, and was highly criticized not just for the Sony cross-modding community debacle, but for the repetitive fetch quests and the oversimplified dialogue systems. The variety of quests and sophisticated dialogue systems of The Witcher being just two examples of very well-executed design in a hugely laudable game. The Witcher's maps were large and varied, and easily traversed, and yet fully populated with a variety of interest points that could be stumbled upon or led to by quest lines and message boards. Combat had multiple trees of skill sets for a variety of playstyles, and switched between quickly once players found the respec item starting around the mid-game. Gradually perfecting the Witcher set items created long-lasting rewards for the different playstyles, and they were highly modifiable. While less effective, The Witcher also had a variety of interesting and comical items for collection, like a sword used for cheese-based fortune-telling. There was a degree of repetitiveness to The Witcher for sure, but it offered enough variety and narrative connections to keep it fresh. But now we have The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild, the new open-world game, Flag Bearer, the new standard by which all open-world games are to be judged. And yet, most games media hasn't taken to comparing both Breath of the Wild and The Witcher 3. Is it just that Breath of the Wild is so ultimately superior to The Witcher 3 in every possible way that no one can remember that The Witcher 3 existed? I don't think this is the case. I think they're remarkably different games, and that's why people can't really compare them. So now we are finally at the point where I can point out why core engagement concepts are so important for this discussion, because the direction and the focus of these two games are vastly different despite both being nearly perfect open-world experiences. But let's just take a moment to appreciate the role that the term open-world game contributed to the fall of the 3D platformer collectathons and turn-based RPGs, which have recently made a resurgence with games like Ratchet & Clank 4 and Yooka-Laylee, and RPGs like Persona 5. The people's nostalgia has caused us to remember a kind of enjoyment not being delivered on by our modern game developers with larger profiles. I recently saw a video by a YouTuber that talked about how important the amount of empty space was in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild to create the sense of scale and the feeling of enjoyment in that game. And for the most part, I agreed with their argument. The scale makes the grandeur and the enjoyment of exploring Breath of the Wild's game world even greater. But notice how that very idea directly contradicts the common wisdom of open world games we had before. That size didn't matter if there wasn't enough variety and density of things to do. This same YouTuber took to a line of argument that I had to disagree with entirely. They began to complain about an unnecessary cluttering of activities and map markers in Ubisoft games, and more recently Guerrilla Games' title Horizon Zero Dawn. Now, Horizon is an amazing game in its own right, having a unique world of living machines, all of which are visibly acting in concert, achieving smaller goals, and working towards some larger end that makes the world itself a mystery to be uncovered. I struggle to think of a game that took a force of nature antagonist and made it a real and constant actor in such a sophisticated way. All these map markers for Horizon are integral to seeing that bigger picture of the world and its goals. Plus, going to those markers always creates multiple lasting benefits in the forms of story, equipment, and convenience. In contrast, the ultimate benefits for finding the 120 shrines in Breath of the Wild are fast travel points, and items that will inevitably be consumed and lost. The utility of collecting all 900 Korok seeds is literally a pile of golden poop. Look it up. See, that degree of repetitiveness and distance, without lasting payoff, is usually a death knell for open world games. And yet it didn't detract from the enjoyment of Zelda at all. In fact, those counterintuitive factors are so important for why Zelda is so successful at what it tried to accomplish. But the existence of densely populated map points didn't really detract from Horizon at all, while The Witcher 3 was somewhere right in the middle, and hardly any repetitiveness for its map points existed. This is because all three of these games have different core engagements as their main focus. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild has a primary core engagement of exploration, and most of its game mechanics are designed to encourage that exploration. From my perspective, a core engagement is best understood as the activity in the game that makes the player feel rewarded for their play. As a result, core engagement is highly subjective to the player. For exploration, the enjoyment comes from merely being in and experiencing the world. The act of just moving forward is the joy. Seeing the beautiful, whimsical world of Zelda is like moving through an art book of desktop wallpapers. Taking pictures with the Sheikah slate lets you capture that moment of I was there and embrace that feeling for a bit more time. Plus, the physics and the chemistry of how fire, metal, wood, electricity, water, and wind all made the game world itself alive and interactive. The constant breaking of every single item in the game pushes the player to move forward, to collect items that act as a safety blanket, to empower moving forward again and collecting more. And I've heard firsthand accounts of how many people are significantly bothered by every weapon that they could obtain, no matter how cool, just breaking and being lost. And yet the fact that it breaks is such an important motivator to make players not rely on one thing, to empower moving forward again and collecting more. And yet the same lack of permanence and the repetitiveness of shrines and Korok seeds is directly discouraging for a different core engagement, often used in open world games. That core engagement is discovery. Discovery is the other half of Bartel's taxonomy archetype called the explorers. The feeling of reward in discovery games comes from uncovering secrets and finding hidden lore. It is the feeling that you have something unique, something new, and something permanent enough to stand the test of time. In The Witcher 3, you find diagrams for Witcher gear for these different nearly dead schools of this particular craft. And not just getting the ability to make the other Witcher items, but the stories of who had to die and the magic or sabotage that brought about these diagrams to be in that part of the world. Yes, there is a lot of hunting monsters, but every bounty has a unique story behind figuring out which monster was the cause and how to prepare. Thus, every unique sword or potion becomes a badge that says, "This is the truth I revealed." The problem with Discovery is that it has massive diminishing returns. A player who feels rewarded by Discovery will explore for hours to find that secret, but will have zero patience for that exploration if what they discover is just more of the same. For an example of a game whose main focus is discovery, see Nier and Nier Automata. Finding and approaching weapons never really changes how the game feels or make it easier, but each step of upgrading reveals a new portion of a short story that informs players to the history of the world that not even the characters in the game know. The ultimate prize for unlocking all of these stories is a new possible ending to the game that reveals even more story. Every bit is about a new experience that points towards the ultimate mystery of what the world is trying to teach you. For fans of open-world games that focus on discovery, exploration-type game mechanics can feel obtrusive and infuriating. Game mechanics that tell a player to take your time and just be in the world of the game acts as walls for players who feel like they want to get to the next new thing as fast as possible every time. Horizon Zero Dawn, on the other hand, puts its main focus on a different core engagement from the other two: achievement. Achievement is a core engagement that creates a feeling of reward from the act of completion. Moving past a boss that marks the end of a zone, filling map markers until none are left, finding every kind of monster, having every kind of armor, and of course getting all the trophies that the game offers for you in the out-of-game account. Anything that brings a bar up to 100% done. Yes, Horizon has discovery and exploration. It has big payoff moments of looking over the scene and taking in the grandeur. But the map markers, the feeling of go there and get that done, fuels that function. And see, this really highlights the problem of using the words open world as a genre tag. Because using this method of bundling vastly different experiences together as though they all point to the same end, both misunderstands the different ways games can form, but more worrisome is that media attention for one game that delivers on one kind of engagement can convince developers that one kind of engagement is superior to others, and thus destroy those kinds of games' ability to get made. Much of games media has been saying that The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is the new standard for open-world games. But ask yourself, what did Breath of the Wild do that a game like Fallout 4 or New Vegas could benefit from? How would Breath of the Wild make Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain a better game? And also ask, what can Breath of the Wild bring to these games for people who aren't fans of The Legend of Zelda? I'm willing to bet that your answers won't be terribly remarkable innovations, and if they are, probably rewrite the foundations of what makes those games uniquely enjoyable experiences. I think that The Breath of the Wild is an amazing game, and the focus on exploration enabled Zelda to be fun and satisfying for a 15-minute session to a 6-hour marathon. And that also made it the perfect game to embody the vision of what the Switch console aims to be. But do we really want to sacrifice what came before and where those games could go because of Zelda? It will be interesting to see the next large open-world game that attempts to be on the Switch. Not Mario. Mario has its own deal, and Nintendo has probably been very carefully planning that for a very long time and knows exactly what it's doing with that game. But if a different developer, a non-Nintendo developer, makes a pass at creating a Zelda-like experience, I imagine they're going to face some design challenges that they're not used to if they try to make other kinds of open world games. As a result, they may split their fan base or maybe not even appeal to either core engagement, discovery, or exploration. Now, I'd like to take some time to outline my own taxonomy of the kinds of core engagement that I've observed and what causes entertainment and feelings of reward in each. Of course, games can and will overlap with their core engagements, but I think this system will be a little more clear than the hodgepodge of genre mixing that has us comparing games like Warframe and Mass Effect for both being third-person over-the-shoulder shooters. I have already gone into exploration, discovery, and achievement in regards to open-world games, so I won't rehash those in too much detail. However, I do want to outline some examples of games that fall into those engagements. For exploration, take a look at The Witness or Subnautica. And controversially, if you'd like to see a version of the game that wasn't done well at release, don't hit that update button and go play No Man's Sky. For examples of discovery, try playing Nier Automata and the Talos Principle. For examples of isolated engagements of achievement, most mobile games will be focusing on this. But for the most part, achievement has been subsumed into the trophy system. Try playing Bloodborne, and focus on how it feels to get past the first area of the game. You'll know the feeling when you see a lantern appear on top of that bridge. Now, a form of core engagement that is very frequent in games is what I call victory. Victory is straightforward enough. This is the feeling that you have been proven to have a skill or mastery that is greater than someone else's. This would fall in line with Bartel's taxonomy and the category of killers. But I take issue with this a little because when we remove the core engagement from a multiplayer game that also contains other engagements that can be spoiled, the negative connotation of the word killer stops being appropriate. Yes, I would agree that when the loser of these games become particularly salty and angry, it adds to the enjoyment of victory, a certain degree of schadenfreude. But I think that feeling feeds into this superiority feeling at the heart of victory, being extended to social or emotional superiority. Games like Street Fighter, Warframe, and Overwatch mainly fall into this group. One of the early core engagements that was prominent in 3D platformers is collection. This is the sense of reward gained from shiny items waiting to be picked up. It's almost an addictive, compulsive reaction, like picking up pennies from the sidewalk. It differs from discovery because the items to pick up are readily available, visually appealing, and have a worth of currency that suggests some further gain down the road. Or sometimes they don't have a worth as currency. Sometimes you just want to pick it up. For this experience, try ukulele, or one of the later Jak and Daxters, or even the original Super Mario. A core engagement that has truly benefited from the recent changes in PC gaming is creation. This is the joy of looking at the rules of how a world works and making something new and unique in it. This is the settlement builder in Fallout 4, and the continued thriving of the creative mode in Minecraft. But this can also be discovering a unique way to shift or execute the metagame in Hearthstone, or any collectible card game and building a deck for that matter. This engagement comes when the player feels empowered to exercise their own artistry. Socialization is a core engagement that most commonly is associated with massive multiplayer online games. Game-like social media websites like Gaia Online and Neopets maximize on this, and Second Life made it the sole focus. But most people who play massive multiplayer RPGs, who stay for long periods of time, actively maintain social groups to continue enjoying the game. Apart from massive multiplayer online games, this sort of engagement most frequently forms outside of games, in fan communities and other social media sites, while not actively given consideration in the game itself. And that's simply because most games are not designing for socialization. Another core engagement in games is story. When I say story, I don't mean the unique forms of environmental storytelling and others that are available to games. I mean the passive enjoyment of listening or seeing someone else's story being told to you. These are the books you find scattered around Skyrim, or the long cutscenes that play in Uncharted. The reason why this is so controversial is because not everyone is in agreement about whether this engagement can rightly be called a game at all. Games are often defined by interactivity, rules, and conditions for failure. When expanded to game narratives, the expectation is that your decisions and actions as a player character can impact the story, and feel like it does so in a substantial way, and potentially a destructive way. If that isn't there, how would games be able to claim to be different from books or radio or movies or television? A story may play from an executable file on a PC, or from a disc or a cartridge, but does that really make that story a game? It is definitely a question that needs to be struggled with. For example, try playing a few of the Telltale series of games, and pay attention to the formula of how Telltale makes its stories. These games really straddle the line and can help you make your own decision of whether they should be called games. Regardless, story plays a large role in gaming, and is often the main reason for playing games in the first place. There is another core engagement that I call number control, and this one is a personal favorite of mine. This is the sense of reward that comes from really digging into the systems of a game, and what strategies can be devised to maximize efficiency on the way to the game's goals, but also in how to turn unique or entertaining options into workable strategies. This kind of engagement is frequently found in turn-based RPGs, real-time strategy like StarCraft, and tactics games like Fire Emblem and XCOM. If you are a Dark Souls player and ever tried to find a way to make a luck build work, you know this feeling. Number control is all about making something specific and advantageous within extremely deep or complex systems. Number control embraces tedium because the time investment has immediate payout and endless experimentation. The last core engagement I want to highlight is simply play. Play is also used to distinguish certain activities of fun away from being games. Like children on a playground, rules are either non-existent or fluidly come and go as the players please. Play can allow for making your own game in the mix of other things, but not being held to it when something more fun comes along, or losing or being stopped when you refuse to cooperate with it. Grand Theft Auto and other sandbox games maximize on just letting players do as they please without pushing or consequence. If you ever play the game Prop Hunt and stop to just look at something stupid that accidentally happened with how a player tried to hide, and then let them go fix it even though the clock was already counting down, then you know what it means to prioritize play in a game above anything else. That ends the list of Socrates' taxonomy, but let me emphasize that I don't believe that this list is exhaustive to any extent. Since I made this list myself without really hashing it out with others, I don't even expect it to be entirely accurate or precise. Perhaps I didn't really get into the root of the enjoyment for some of the core engagements I proposed, or conflated different core engagements together. But at the same time, I think I've been able to highlight what makes a wide variety of games rewarding for different people, and why a criticism of a game might not be an inherent problem in its design, but a mechanic pointed towards a core engagement that we simply aren't interested in. Imagine what kind of games can be made when the first question is, what kind of fun do you want to make? Rather than, where should the camera be placed? Or, how big should we make the map? And when reviewing games, we can more directly talk about why it's enjoyable and how well it delivered on that experience. Imagine an open-world game where numbers control is the core engagement, or a first-person shooter focused on empowering player creation. If we shift our thinking in this way, think of how much wider and limitless the old genres can become. I think it would help us reach what I think we all can agree is the ultimate goal: to play more games. Thank you for listening to this more podcast-style analysis. I originally only thought to speak shortly about why I thought the term open world was problematic, but as I wrote, I realized that the issue was a bit more fundamental and affects far more than just this one kind of game that I play frequently. If you enjoyed listening, consider following me for more reviews and analysis like this, And leave a review as well, and maybe show your friends or share around social media. I really appreciate all of you who take the time to engage with these ideas. And as always, stay true.